Hi, Michael. Nice to see you, if only virtually. People, I need to say something at the start, which is I am suffering from laryngitis, and Julie knows this, so does Michael. I'm going to go on as long as I can, and if my voice doesn't last, I'm going to ask Michael Barnes to fill in for me. So the last time Michael Storper and I saw each other face to face was in San Francisco almost 5 years ago when he was giving a talk. And I still have the leaflet from that talk. Here it is. And I'm going to read what it says. It says, 48 Hills presents a talk by internationally renowned UCLA urban and economic geographer, Michael Storper. Why, and this is the title. I made up the leaflet, but Michael did the name of the talk. Why Scott Wiener's SB 50 will not get us affordable housing. The new trickle-down housing economics, build for the richest 30% and cross your fingers for everyone else. That talk, by the way, there's a video of it on the 48 Hills website, and CALE stalwart Mark Vilville has done a transcription of the talk. Michael Storper is indeed one of the eminent geographers of our time. He's celebrated for his theoretical and his empirical breakthroughs. Teaches at UCLA, at the London School of Economics, and Sciences Po in Paris. He's also, in my experience, he practices collegiality that is generous among academics. Thank you, Michael. Shortly before you gave that talk in San Francisco, you and your LSE colleague, Andres Rodriguez Pose, had posted online a paper that would soon be published by Urban Studies, the journal Urban Studies. It was called, it's not as witty as the one that you, we were talking in San Francisco, it was called Housing, Urban Growth and Inequalities, the Limits to Deregulation and Upzoning in Reducing Economic and Spatial Inequality. That paper challenged the conventional academic wisdom, what you called the housing as opportunity school of thought. That wisdom about, so-called wisdom, about the relationship between local constraints on housing and affordability. And it sparked a sharp debate in urban studies with 3 of your UCLA colleagues. Up to then, you'd written about housing, but you weren't known as a planning scholar. Now your urban studies paper is routinely cited by academic and actually non-academic commentators on housing regulation and affordability. How did you and Rodriguez Pose come to write that paper? What did you mean by the housing as opportunity school of thought, and how did you challenge it? There's my questions.
All right, thanks, Hilda. And I also have the voice thing. I'm coming out of a laryngitis. It's the season. So I do have a voice today that's sort of working. So, but a little apologies if it cracks. Actually, so you're right, Zelda. I mean, housing has never been the core of my own work. And my colleague Andres and I kind of backed into it because in my, specialized wonky academic world, there were a bunch of influential papers starting to be written, not only about housing as a local issue, but making claims that a lot of the country's problems would be fixed if only the places that are not constructing enough housing in this story would construct it, because in these models, it would allow people to go to cities, desirable cities that aren't going there now. And in particular, there was a paper by someone from Berkeley, someone from Chicago, and then there's been other ones. And so the story behind this view of the world is that attractive metropolitan areas like the Bay Area, LA, New York, Seattle, and so on and so forth, that they're keeping people out by not constructing enough housing, driving the price up, and that there's all these people who would want to go to these places if they could. So a lot of these papers do really like like their imaginary, they cook up numbers and they tell you, for example, that here in California, if we assumed supposedly our duty of constructing all this housing, that we would get millions of more people coming. So Andres and I, we work on the scale of what we call interregional, the whole urban system. And we started reading these papers and going, looks like nonsense to us. And it's not that it's irrelevant. Housing is obviously important to people's choices and what they can do in the world. But in today's world, the biggest thing controlling where people are going is jobs. And if we take the Bay Area as an extreme case, Bay Area is one of the most skilled regions in the world. And whether you like it or not, lots of the old jobs, for example, in manufacturing, they're gone. Again, we can like that or not like it, but the kind of underlying story of most of big metropolitan California is that the job mix that we have evolved tends to require fairly high levels of skill. And a lot of the other kinds of jobs in America have moved to other cities. So now what you're getting is a landscape that's really different from way back in the 70s or 80s, the sort of old world period where manufacturing was pretty high, was spread around, or what we might call middle skill jobs were spread across the landscape, and they mixed a lot with high skill jobs. Since roughly 70 or 80, they're now like middle skill cities and high skill cities. I'm kind of simplifying, but that's what we find in the data. So looping back to the housing issue, is someone in Ohio who's coming out of manufacturing not coming to California because of housing, principally, or are they not coming here because simply the kinds of the job base that we have doesn't correspond to their skills? And what Andres and I argued is that it's the latter. So that loops back to that housing stuff, because the housing scholars are telling us that we built walls that were really bad, we keep people out, especially in California, that's the narrative, and that there's these other places that are offering opportunity. Now, I don't want to exaggerate. I mean, there is an element in all this that's potentially relevant, that some people who would want to come here if the housing were cheap aren't coming. But still, the kind of underlying story of making these promises seem to us to not hold up. And that leads to a second point, and then I'll conclude. So if you look at what the people on the side of principally upzoning, what they're saying is two contradictory things. They're telling you that if we build all this new housing by, mostly through upzoning, the kind of Scott Wiener type legislation, that will add housing supply and drive the price down. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that is not very true. We could come back to them. But even without going into those reasons, it's incompatible with this other thing they're saying, which is millions of new people will come. Because if you build a bunch of new housing, but you add millions of new people, you're not going to get affordability because you'll increase the demand. Right? So we were just kind of going into the field and really picking apart these claims that we felt were not, weren't solid, weren't meeting the standards of proof that at least I think we should have. So, okay, I'll stop there on that question. You know, I get very wonky on all this, but that's
That really wasn't wonky. I've seen wonky. This
yeah.
isn't wonky. Um, so I don't know what to call it. The YIMBY school, the Wiener school, the Ed Glazer school. There's so many possibilities. None of those names really encompass the whole thing. Let's call it the Wiener school. But that's something we can all grab onto. They talk a lot about demand. I mean, one of their claims is that you're not building enough housing to meet the demand, but they don't talk about the content, the composition of that demand. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, it's really an odd thing because obviously, academics and so on often simplify because they want to have a nice, pretty model, and we all do that. But the, most striking characteristic of housing demand in a place like California is indeed the what we call the income distribution, right? Meaning the distribution of income across different kinds of households. And it is a really important problem that we have, that we are a wealthy state, but we're a very unequal state. Okay. So that, and you can add to the overall, the fact that we have a large number of high-income households, and they have a lot of influence on the housing market. But in addition, even within California, those households are mostly concentrated in the core of the Bay Area, LA, and San Diego. Okay, so that drives the structure of demand in those regions much more than way back a half century ago, when the inequalities of income were lower. So it's like a structural thing that if you're going to deregulate or build housing, the market is going to tend to respond to where the most powerful demand is. So if you don't take that into account, it seems to me quite naive.
So are you basically saying the other side, let's be polite, they're naive? Why don't they want to talk about that structural, that inequality, the income inequality, which you call the wage premium of the highly skilled workers? What do you think?
I mean, I don't, it's hard for me to like assess motivations, but it does seem like, they have, I think, what I've seen, at least in the political debate, is they have this like very simple point that they make with too simple. They tell us we didn't construct enough housing. There's a simple solution for it. You basically do all these upzoning and zoning overrides. Miraculously, the market will respond. It'll build new supply. They admit that it will build it for it'll be skewed toward the high end, but then they say there's a beautiful mechanism called filtering.
Right.
Meaning that in the way of thinking they have, middle high to high income households will move into the new housing that's constructed. So like they'll move up the food chain, and that will free up housing in other places that people who were of lower income will then occupy. And what they're doing there is they are looking at a reality that existed, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the cities of the East Coast. What happened back then, it's true that you had these, like, for example, immigrant neighborhoods would generally be places where the middle class was moving out, and people would move into. We've had that historically in California. However, it was also a time when even those cities were sort of like in a different, I'm just not sure how to say it. They were in a different phase of their growth, and they were beginning their own process. So a key thing is they were beginning to suburbanize from roughly the 1920s onward. And suburbanization, when you have a lot of available land. So imagine that LA hadn't hit the wall, or the Bay Area didn't go all the way to Tracy, or Santa Cruz now. Like, say, LA in the 1940s. Actually, LA in the 1940s had a lot of land that was accessible. What it meant was that you could build on that land, and we sprawled outward. And it did actually have that effect, because the middle classes moved out to new suburbs, and the inner city areas had less pressure. They got occupied by other groups. There were different kinds of problems associated with that. But what is the world like today? So in 1920, America had 100 million people. In 2023, it has 340 million people and a built-out urban system. And nowhere more so than here in California, where, we've been successful. The price of success is, we have sprawled way out everywhere, and there isn't a lot of cheap land to build on anymore that is transportation accessible. So, that's kind of like the other fault in their reasoning, is they're kind of telling us a story from the past for the world that exists today. And what they're promising us is that infill will give us filtering. Whereas in the past, it was outfill that gave us filtering on cheap land where you didn't have neighbors already. You could just go in with a developer and mass produce housing. You kept the cost down. That is not the world we're living in. And it's nobody's fault. It's just a natural consequence of, we have a big built out urban system, and we're dealing with a different process. So there's just a lot of confusion in what they're claiming about how this is all going to work.
They would argue that there's no such thing as a built out, that.
Yeah, you're right. That's right. Yeah.
Right, that's it. So in that same paper, you wrote blanket, and this is a direct quote, blanket upzoning, I added the blanket, but that's what you meant, is not the kind of delicate and complex policy mix that is required to address interpersonal inequality in our cities. What ingredients would go into such a mix? That's a hard question, but that's the one everybody wants to answer. Do you have some ideas for us?
So there, I really, I think this is one of the toughest challenges we're facing. In 2024, like, how can you find really the problem is in big, prosperous metropolitan areas. What would it take to build housing for the big middle or lower end of the income distribution? Quality housing that people want to live in, that's accessible. We all know this is this huge challenge that we're facing. And what I don't feel is going to happen is blanket upzoning. I don't think that will work because, and we've already seen it, when the upzoning happens, there is housing that gets constructed, but we know what it looks like and what price it's at. And it certainly isn't for a lot of households. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? Land is actually really big. It's expensive. And when you upzone it, it gets more expensive. Constructing today to the quality standards that we have, it's not 1900. We would throw up cheap houses back then. The amenities that you have to have are totally different, the safety features. And the other thing is that vertical infill, it's expensive. It is not cheap to construct high. And I'm not a great expert on construction costs, but these are kind of like basics stories. is so there, and when I used to listen to their back of the envelope calculations, like you take a lot, with a $1 million house on it, you put 4 units up, and miraculously there's 4 $250,000 units. Well, it doesn't work that way. Not even close. And we all know that. But somehow it's a myth that pervades this debate. And when I see the journalists, they eat it up, and it's very annoying. And in particular, so Zelda's right. I mean, density is a way that ultimately America's a low density country by world standards. But, it is the way we will ultimately go. But density is expensive, and pulling it off, most especially in a way that it works, meaning that you get the good side of density without the bad, it requires a lot of policy intervention. And I could go on and on because I'm half European and we do density. But I can tell you that, the kind of stuff you have to do to build a dense neighborhood where people who would otherwise want to live in a single family home say to themselves, that's a desirable way of life. I can raise kids there. I feel safe. It's not noisy. So, if we want to do that, it isn't just by, clicking our fingers and upzoning and building some buildings that are 5 stories tall that you're going to get that. It's simply, that's completely misleading.
Do you think the private real estate industry can build that sort of housing?
Look, I think there are people there's some people in that industry who are really trying to think about it. Sometimes I see them come through our planning school. I think the problem is, though, that we don't have the policy mix to pull it off, meaning imagine a world of density that isn't a density that's attractive and affordable to middle class people. It just requires a huge number of things that we're not all that equipped to do right now. So I'm not like an anti-density person, but there's a naivete in they're telling us that it's gonna happen miraculously in a desirable way. And I have an example. One of my professors at Berkeley was a British man who wrote a classical book in planning called Great Planning Disasters. And he had 10 examples, one of which was BART, by the way. If you look at lots of parts of LA, it was densified in the 1940s and 1950s. That is, large parts of West LA actually were single family homes, and they allowed apartment buildings to be constructed on them. So, it's like the dingbat architecture of West LA and Santa Monica and all that. Those aren't horrible neighborhoods by any means, and they're now kind of gentrified. But here's the thing. They don't meet the standards of successful density today. They're totally car dependent, right? A lot of the buildings are aging. They don't offer the space for families that families need. They've actually gotten quite expensive. So, that's kind of what I mean. You can't just take one thing and say, put up density, and then it's all going to be wonderful.
I want to ask you about something that we discussed once in an email exchange, and it's about the RHNAs. It's not about the mystical calculations that inform, or maybe say deform, determine the RHNA outcomes, at least the numbers. What do you as an economic geographer think about the RHNA's theoretical justification that is requiring each jurisdiction, each local jurisdiction to take responsibility, that, you're responsible for planning to build a certain amount of projected growth? Do you remember what we said?
Now we're getting into the politics of it all. And,
Yeah.
I don't want to pretend to be like the world's expert on American federalism and all that local control. What strikes me though as a scholar is this. So from my world, if you like, we were always told by the same people who are now advocating overrides of local power. They used to use a theory that privileged local control and even local competition. It's called the Tibu model if you're interested. But it's like the standard model is that, a metropolitan area is like a shopping mall, and you get all these different, municipal governments or neighborhoods, and each of them offers a different sort of product, a different kind of housing, a different vibe, different cost structure, and that people, by being offered all this choice, that they'll go to the place that best suits them, and that there should be something for everyone, and that this competition is actually good in this view of the world, because every place has to kind of up its game by thinking about who's doing something else. Okay, so almost all of the authorities who are now arguing that we should override because of NIMBYism, in their view, used to use that theory. And then they just turned on their heels and said, now we need to control it from above. And, I'm quite personally, our system may be flawed as it is, but when people argue I get nervous when people argue essentially to centralize power, because when you push decisions up, those who can influence them best tend to be those who are highly mobilized and have the resources, to go to Sacramento or Washington. We know that. It's like a basic tenet of, that's kind of, I think, why many of us are attached to, local government, even knowing that local government isn't perfect. So, yeah, I do find it really, odd that there's this wave of we should override the locals.
This is to change subject a little bit. Actually, in your San Francisco talk, you warned that things change. You were actually talking, I think you're referring to San Francisco's or the Bay Area's high-tech boom. And we can talk about that, but I wanted to ask about a different change, which is that California, it may be related. California is no longer growing the way it used to, and it may never grow that way again. What do you think that portends for the state's economy and for housing and land use in particular? And I have a big question, even bigger question. Do you think growth is essential for shared prosperity? That's really a basic question, but it's kind of, whoa.
I'm not sure I have an answer to the last one. That's one of the hardest questions is,
yeah, I know.
Can we have a non-growth? Yeah, I mean, we could maybe look to Japan for an answer. But going back to the growth of California, yeah, actually, I think I wasn't thinking enough about this, but there are fundamental demographic shifts going on. I mean, there's two things going on. One is that there's geographical shifts within America, and it's true. More people are moving to Texas than are, on net moving to California. We had many decades where we were growing leaps and bounds, and we, expanded all over the place. But now we're, almost 40 million people. With our job mix, and this is kind of the point. So the people that I'm debating with, they say that we're wrong and that we should be growing more. And we would grow more if only we would offer cheap housing, and we would offer cheap housing if only we would deregulate and construct. That's their narrative. So those are those simulations. We would get all these millions of people who are now going to Texas or wherever they're going. I think that's not a solid narrative for the simple reason that, like I said in starting, we have a job mix. It's a polarized job mix. We kind of have like a lot of high-skilled people, and then we have this big low to middle skilled service sector, and they go together. We're very service dependent. The people who, drive trucks and, run the restaurants and all that. Everyone can't be, a Silicon Valley techie, but they're like demographics of that kind of job growth. And it's not going to be the job growth that we had in 1930, 1940, 1950. Places like Texas have a very different job mix. And it's probably more favorable to demographic growth, but their income growth isn't that great. That is to say, a lot of the places that are still growing in population, they have lower incomes than California does, even with all our inequalities. So, like the whole attitude that you measure a place by how many people that are coming into it. You say a successful place is one where people are coming into. That's one view of the world. I don't subscribe to it. I think there's an issue, not only the quantity, but the quality of growth. And I think the other really big one there, Zelda, is the whole country is about, we are a country that's built on growth and land abundance. We're now a big country with 340 million people, but our population is about, in a couple of decades, it'll stagnate. If all the, that's the prediction, because people are having smaller families, and we will enter into, in fact, most of the world in the mid 21st century is gonna enter into a population leveling or decline process. Well, we've never even thought about that in this country, right? It's completely not in the way we think about reality. But building a city is like most buildings are, you build them if they're decent to last a century. So there's all kinds of things, but I think what you're implying, Zelda, is absolutely right. That probably California is going to grow more slowly than it was in the gangbuster era of the 20th century. I don't think that's a bad thing, as long as the quality of the growth that we offer is good. That's the real thing that I think I concentrate on.
What do you mean by quality? High income, high wages? Is that the criterion?
That's part of it. I mean,
Okay.
Wages that are wages or incomes that allow the majority of people to live a quality life. But then it's also other things that you do, all the things that we know we have to provide: transit, education, safety, culture, all of that is the public sector part of it. But I don't think we should have the image of we are only going to be successful if we add the same number of people in the coming decade that we added in the 1950s. I don't see why we should be held to that standard. And again, I will say it over and over again, a lot of the states that have had or are still growing rapidly, they're in a phase where they have quality problems, meaning they have a lot of low-wage jobs. They have problems. I mean, we can measure these things. So when they make a claim, we're so successful because we're getting all these millions of people. Another point of view is, what's the quality of life that these people have when they get to your place? And the numbers are more complicated on that latter topic. And I just say that because California always gets criticized, as if we're some kind of failure operation because we're not growing as fast as we were in the 1950s. I think that's completely ridiculous as a standard to hold us to.
Thank you. So Michael, you're doing most of the talking, which is fine by me, given the state of my voice. I appreciate it.
Sorry,
So
I
and
get
I'm here
going.
to, you know, it's almost 4:40, and I think it's probably time to invite people to ask questions. John Mirish, you seem to be first in line. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. And I want to say I appreciate your work. You and I also saw Professor Ambrosio is online, or a couple of the academics who go against the wave. I'm on SCAG subcommittees and have had to put up with the rhetoric of Paavo Munkinen and some of the ones you debate with, and appreciate your showing them what for. I also just briefly wanted to say that I'm also European, half European. I'm Swedish and lived there for many years. And so Stockholm is one of my favorite cities in the world. But it must be said, in terms of density, many Swedish people have country houses. They satisfy the need for space by going to the country in the summer and weekends. And there is a lot of open space there. And there's also a safety net in Sweden. There's less income inequality. The economic conditions are very different. So I'd love it if we could be more Swedish. That said, Americans do seem to like space and yards. And I take the position there's nothing wrong with homes with yards, whereas these YIMBYs or WIMBYs try and force density upon people. And if they are people who believe in the market trying to force people, as you talked about Tebow before, that's not going to work. The other point I wanted to make before coming to my question is that when we talk about superstar cities, like Glazer likes to do, we ignore the fact that the people in Ohio who we've spoken about, some of them love their communities, and they would love nothing more than to be able to stay there if we could provide them with the economic opportunities to do so. And I can, mention my friend Nan Whaley, who used to be the mayor of Dayton, Ohio. She's not looking for California to build housing so her residents can move here. So that's one thing. One thing that I've been trying to, and this group has discussed and known for a long time, is to try and create anti-speculation housing policy. When we're building now at the upper end, it seems we're building for private equity, for speculators, for corporations. When we talk about the demand, have you given any thought to a variety of anti-speculation housing policies that would ensure or would aim to try and support the middle class to allow more people who wanted to become homeowners, rather than having those homes, whether they're condos or single family homes, end up in the hands of private equity? That could include antitrust legislation. That could include, there's a few bills pending at the federal level. That could include vacancy taxes and a number of other issues. Love to know your thoughts on anti-speculation housing policy as a way to create affordability as opposed to market fundamentalism.
That is a really big one. I mean, in a good way. So, at least in my world, people are starting to try and understand the changing structure of ownership of land and housing. And, the movement of big capital and big owners into places that used to be, individual households or all that, including, by the way, on a national scale.
Yes.
A lot of the land that was held by kind of like small to medium-sized owners, even in remote places like Montana, it's been snapped up. So we're again in a different historical reality where the abundance and fungibility of land that we used to have doesn't exist anymore. I'm not an expert on that particular question, what to do, but I've heard, and again, here we run up to, though, what are we willing to do in this country with its particular political culture? The example that we in sort of the urban literature always cite of success is London. And the reason is that there's a giant amount of publicly owned housing and land. And even when they redevelop it, they never sell the land off. Meaning, right now, the fashion in London is they have a lot of public housing because the city got bombed in the Second World War, and a lot of that land was taken over. And as a result, it actually has pretty successful policy, and very mixed neighborhoods, more than any other big city I know. But so that comes under pressure. And a lot of what they're doing now is they take these big housing pieces of land, housing estates, they call them. And sometimes they'll do a public-private thing where they'll allow a private developer to put some housing on it in return for paying for a lot of the redo of the public. But it's through a leasehold because they know that once you sell the land off, the public sector will never get it back because it'll become too expensive. Any well-located land, it's like the most valuable commodity in the world, right? So there is an issue of the control of land. And I also agree with you. Again, it kind of gets into stuff I don't feel comfortable in, but I do think we absolutely need to look into housing finance, into the tax structures that we use, and because it looks like it's happening. Right?
Thanks. Susan Candell.
Hi, thank you, Michael, for coming again. It's really a joy to hear you speak. So two things that kind of relate to each other. So have you looked at Scott Wiener's new SB 951, who he is going to try to withdraw San Francisco from the coastal zone altogether, as well as all of the coastal zones along California are shrinking in terms of what the Coastal Commission can hear in terms of housing appeals. I mean, it's shrinking a lot. And, I'm a diehard liberal, a Democrat, and why do I feel so hurt and abandoned by our party, where here we are trying to protect our coasts and protect CEQA and protect, gentrification in our cities. And we have a supermajority of Democrats in Sacramento. And so have you looked at this bill, and what do you think it's going to do to California, and how are people going to respond to it?
I actually don't know about that bill, but I share your sentiment. There's a history in California, when there was a crisis of rapid development in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the state citizens mostly supported, widespread environmental regulations so that we wouldn't wreck the beautiful state that we have. And, people have different opinions on it. I personally think it's been a successful policy, because if you look at how the coasts of certain other states have been trashed up, and we did make some mistakes early on, but it's because of the Coastal Commission that we sort of stopped it before everything got wrecked.
Right.
That's just the history of it. Now, I think there is one other problem that I'm sympathetic to, which is, okay, we regulate things and we're not always that efficient about it, right? I think everybody feels like, whether you're kind of for or against, we all know that we think it could run more smoothly. But, the perfect can be the enemy of the good.
Right.
I find it quite shocking to see people who say they are, kind of on the Democratic side of things, to all of a sudden be like anti-government. It's like a complete
Yeah.
It's like an upside down thing.
It's a completely upside down thing. And so this leads into the next one. So have you heard of Our Neighborhood Voices? That's our effort to get a constitutional amendment to bring all land use and zoning back to the cities away from the state. And when there's a conflict. And so cities can choose, which bills are working for them or not. And so all of a sudden you see this SB 951 where he's, selling our coastline to out to developers under the guise of affordable housing. Nonetheless, it's like callable, right? So have you looked at the initiative, and what do you think what do you think of it, and what do you think of ways where we can get the news out and try to get this thing on the ballot?
Well, there you're asking me about political strategy
I know.
questions, and I'm just
Yeah.
an academic.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I do think though, what I even see in my world is how to kind of get like a story that's simple and that people can understand, because we're in this stuff, so we understand it. But you have a lot of people, I often face this question like like some, family dinner on Thanksgiving. And you want to explain this stuff to people. And it's kind of like the other side has this intuitively appealing story. The bad people are not allowing housing.
Right.
Construct it, and then the world will be good. And so we have, I think, in getting our word out, people don't like my academic kind of message, which is it's complex, right? That's a hard sell in and even the other thing that I could really get going on that's upsetting to me is the journalists. I am scandalized that they are not more skilled in understanding these issues that we're talking about. They should have some level of expertise, and a lot of them really just buy the simple story, and they put it out there in an article. If I have to read another New York Times article saying how horrible California is, it just really kind of drives me up the wall. But so yes, I think the issue for that is to explain to people why local control may be not perfect, but is essential.
Correct. Okay.
So
Thank you. Appreciate it. Great.
Some political strategists will have to figure that one out.
I just
Thank
want to,
you.
I want to just intervene here briefly. I don't think Wiener and company are anti-regulation or anti-government. In fact, they are pro-regulation. It's just they're pro-regulation that benefit private capital, big capital. I mean, think about all the laws, think about the arenas, the housing element. I could go on and on and on and on. It's not anti-government. It's what I call authoritarian capitalism. But anyway, okay, Dennis Richards. I could go on too. Dennis.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm kind of a veteran at this subject, along with several people here on this call that I could point out everybody that I've met with over the past 7 years when Wiener first went to Sacramento. And I get really frustrated as well with I was with a reporter on Friday, and I met with him for 2 hours. We're talking about corruption in San Francisco, but there was somebody in the cafe we were at that actually came up and said, we were started talking, and I knew her from a project that there was some issues with. And I turned to her and I said, I hope you don't vote for Scott Wiener. And she said, no effing way. And the reporter said to me, why don't you like Scott Wiener? And I told him about state intrusion into local land use. He says, but we need more housing. And this is a reporter that I really respect. And I kind of was taken aback, like they're buying the myth. And I guess they've got control of the narrative. They really do. And I was in 5 years ago hearing you at the Gay and Lesbian Center, just like Zelda was. And now it's 7 years since Wiener went to Sacramento, and they're declaring victory. The Embrees are declaring victory with SB 423, now SB 951. And there was a discussion that we had on an email thread that Nielsen Buchanan started, who was in Palo Alto, and Eric Filseth, who I think is on this call somewhere. He said, let the YIMBYs, let's let it play out, and then we could throw it back in their face and like, look, it didn't get the intended consequences that you want. I guess the question I have is that an option that people really want? Like, let the arena numbers get, they're cooked, right? Nobody's going to make them. I mean, I don't know if there's any jurisdiction of the nearly 500 they're going to make them. And then let's see in 2027 and 2030, 2031, where we're at. And I guess the question for me is, it's kind of a crapshoot. Yeah, I think Eric is right. We're not going to get, and Mr. Storper, Professor Storper, you also reiterated that. It's not going to get us what we want. The question is, do we want to wait and see? And I go back to Julie's thing. Maybe it's time we all mobilize and get Sacramento out of planning and zoning at this point. I'd rather not wait to see what the world's going to look like to prove them wrong. So, any comments on that?
Yes, it's really interesting the way you laid it out. I mean, to me, look, the history of policies for cities is littered with some successes, but littered with a lot of mistakes. And that's the problem, is when you make these mistakes, it's 30 years later that you come back and you go, we failed, we did the wrong thing, or we didn't do anything. And now our cities have paid the consequences. So now part of that's just, I think, natural, maybe, human, fallibility. But no, I don't think we can just sit by. We do need to find a way to build and rebuild our cities. They're organic living things. But unleashing these forces that the Wiener approach will unleash is, in my view, unleashing a potentially destructive wave that it will be really hard to undo once they get it going. So remember, like, for example, frankly, way back in the freeway days when, you had a bunch of experts who came in and said, we're going to promise you transportation heaven if you only do this. We have a lot of authority, we've advanced degrees, we talk a good line. And they, frankly, okay, freeways have had some successes, but they also wrecked a lot of urban neighborhoods. But it's only 30 or 40 years later that then you have to clean the mess up. So I don't think we can sit by.
Got it. So one last point then. Everybody on this call, you heard what he just said. If you want to sit by and you want to have our cities disfigured, go right ahead and just keep talking academically about this for the next 6 or 7 years. If you want to get involved, our neighborhood voices is the only thing standing between you, your cities, and the stuff that you're going to see that's going to come out, just like he outlined, period. End of story for me. And I don't want to be
Dennis,
here.
I'm sorry, but it's almost 5 o'clock and there are 2 other people who want to
I'm
ask.
sorry. I apologize. I didn't realize.
So I think we're going to move on. Anurag Jain, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Go right ahead.
Yes, you did. Thank you. It should be quick. So thanks a lot, Michael, for coming here, and it was great to hear from you directly. I think you are in academics, and a lot of us believe in numbers, we believe in facts. When we look at RENA and the projections they have made, we don't believe it's based on facts. It just doesn't make sense. They are thinking about housing production, which we haven't done ever at that rate for a consistent period of time. So I would love to hear your views on how an organization which is run by government completely ignore the facts and put forth numbers which are not factual. And where's our academic community to challenge them? The second question is slightly controversial. I know people have different opinions. There's a big organization of people, Flanley is the name. They have acquired large swaths of land just north of where we are in Northern California. And they plan to build a city by themselves. And I have heard people's different opinion on whether it will solve anything or not. that would be the other thing I would be curious to know your views on it. And thank you for your time again.
Thanks for the comments. All right, so numbers. Of course, I'm a believer in facts. I mean, it's my deepest belief is that that's what a scientific approach is supposed to do, is come up with, insights about reality that are real. However, let's be honest about it. Different people can develop different facts by using different assumptions or by including or excluding points of view. That's why you have controversies. And it's kind of easier to resolve those like in natural sciences than in economics. But a lot of what's going on, I think, is that the facts that these people are purporting to develop, for me, a lot of the research was based on unrealistic setups or unrealistic assumptions about reality. So yeah, there's a contest of numbers, and we have to engage with it, right? And they've done a lot of shoddy numbers, in my opinion. On the Solano County thing, I mean, look, I only know as much as like what I've read in the press. The one thing I could say, though, is that there's a history of these attempts to build utopian cities out of nothing. It's a long tradition of them. So around the world, you get examples of the kind of build it from zero. Think about Brasilia in Brazil, right? Or Chandigarh, so it's an old story, including in this country, the idea of building like in the East Coast, there were like historically groups like the Shakers, and they wanted to go build a perfect town, temple on the hill that would be perfect. So, I'm a little skeptical about them, but more so than that, it's who's controlling this thing. It seems to me like a very restricted number of people who are basically wealthy tech investors, and they think they can build a better city than anyone else. But whose city will it be? It'll be, I guess, like a giant gated community or something. I'm not exactly sure what the legal structure is. So I'm a little skeptical about a bunch of dimensions of that. Are they going to be able to pull it off? What are they doing it for? Who will govern it? And one thing about cities is they never end up the way you intended. So that's the thing about those utopian things. I mean, Brasilia is not at all what the designer said it was going to be. So, just that's a few reflections there.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Wally, Seaback?
I'm gonna jump in real quick. First of all, just to let everybody know, California Forever will be coming to Cali in a few weeks. They've agreed to come, and we're just working out the details of it. So all of those questions, Michael, you're welcome to come and see what they can answer for us, because we're very interested. And we will not take any more raised hands. I should have jumped in a little bit earlier on that. And Michael, we asked you for an hour or more. Are you able to stay for the last hands up, or what would you like us to cut this off? You're muted, so I'm thinking with the nodded head, you're saying you're gonna stay.
No problem.
Fantastic. Okay, then I'm gonna give it back to Zelda, and David will be our last question. Okay.
And Wally is our next question. Wally.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Michael, what a pleasure to hear from you. I was in graduate school in the 70s at UCLA urban planning with Friedman and Soja and Wax and so forth. And you were a legend even then. So it is terrific to hear from you directly. on the topic of sprawl, it is used in the press and by SCAG as a place. And I always say it's not a place, it's a development pattern. And so you can build things correctly. And what would that be? I'm working on a concept of a proximity. And I gave a talk recently at SCAG about how you plan for proximity. The sort of current nomenclature of that is a 15-minute neighborhood or something like that. So one topic I would hope you could comment on would be the power of proximity to get us to quality growth if we have to have growth. The second is I am concerned about climate change and climate migrants. And I wonder if that's a topic if you wouldn't touch on for a moment. In other words, who's going to live in Phoenix in 5 years? So those are the two things I'd hope you would touch on briefly. And thanks again. It's lovely to meet you.
Sure. Well, thanks for the compliments. Someone earlier mentioned, this issue that I think is a hard one, which is, to me, there are really a lot of people who want the comfort of and the privacy of a private house and their own yard and all that stuff. Okay. And there's a cultural element to that. I often, I have this slide that I present my students where I show when you compare North America cities to any other region in the world, they're just much lower density because it's a big country, it's a rich country, it's had a lot of land. And there's a cultural element too, right? So, and I'm where I do, I have my own ideas, but I am a little wary of, planners or whoever coming in and telling people you have to live differently. We have an idea. Now, I don't think we shouldn't do any of it. In a way, the role of people studying things is to try and offer up alternatives for the future. So looping to that one, we have a mixed experience with trying to promote density in America. We do have, though, we have a few dense cities like New York. So I'm not sure I have an answer to this one, but the one thing I'm pretty convinced of is if we believe that density is an important ingredient in the future of our cities, we have to come up with a narrative that convinces people, that makes them want it. Not something like, oh, a bunch of planners are trying to force a lifestyle on me that I don't want. I mean, I'm convinced that there's an issue there. And I know from comparative experience, I can tell you because I'm half French, the default there is density because the density is really prestigious and attractive. So that's just different kind of like ingrained options and cultural patterns. Now, you don't want to say, be like them. I'm very wary of that. But I do, okay, so I'm kind of rambling all over the place. I do think that if we believe that mixing in more density is important, I actually think it probably is. We need a narrative about how we can do it well, that's attractive and for ordinary people, not, just another piece of Manhattan. That's completely irrelevant to the lives of most people.
Well, I'm talking about low density. I'm talking about low density proximity, but that's a different subject.
Okay, sorry. That's an interesting subject too. Yeah.
But comment on the climate and Phoenix and our migrants.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I look, all my friends who work on climate change, they do make the argument that we have a huge problem that we're in denial about, which is our urban form is particularly susceptible to harsh climate change impacts. It's extremely expensive to convert what we have. It just takes a lot of service space to maintain this form of urbanization, and the cost of doing it alone, not to mention the technical side. So, there's a bit of a debate about when does urban density help you with climate change, and when is it so dense that it's like, heat island and all that kind of stuff. So we don't know the answer. People are experimenting on the ground with new urban technologies all over the place. Yeah, I think it's worrisome here. To me, we're kind of like, we've got our head in the sand, and I'm not sure what we're going to do. And I think the cost of it will be very, very high. Cost of conversion.
We've got our head in the sand and the sand is rising. Right? Thanks. Michael Barnes.
Can you guys hear me?
I can.
Michael, thanks again for showing up. I want to follow up on something that you said to me years ago. I think it was pre-COVID. It might have been after your San Francisco talk. You pointed out that, the standard story about when technological innovation happens, there's a cities cluster around these technologies because there's, network externalities. It creates a group of skilled workers, blah, blah, blah. But you also pointed out that over time, that effect goes away as skills become more routinized, people move around. Good examples are Detroit is no longer the only center of automotive production in the world, and Manchester is no longer the center of textile production in the world. These technologies and the skills that are required to run these technologies have diffused out across the planet. So my question is, are we seeing that effect in California with high tech? And was the way people spread out during COVID was COVID something that just accelerated that effect, or was COVID really something new? And does that kind of explain the lack of growth? So take any piece of that you like.
Wow, those are hard ones. So I can say on the COVID thing, what we are seeing in the data is that the people who left for, Boise or wherever, they're back. What the change though might be is that, so they're going back to the major metropolitan areas because they appear to still want the access to all the things that are in the metropolitan area, but they're not going to work every day. So their locational choice within the metro area might be different from pre-COVID because they're not going into the office 5 days a week, but they are back in the metro areas. Now, your second question, sort of about the robustness of our economies. It's true. I mean, there's a cycle, right? So what we observe is newer industries or more skilled industries tend to cluster more than older or less skilled ones. And there are histories, like you said, of places that had vibrant clusters losing them. Pittsburgh lost steel, Detroit has the car companies, but it lost a lot of the manufacturing, and so on and so forth. Is that happening here? I don't think, we lost our manufacturing because it went to cheaper states or to Latin America or China. But if you take the Bay Area, to me, it still looks like it's capturing new waves of tech. So now, the AI people, they're in Hayes Valley, not in Palo Alto, but they're in the Bay Area because the Bay Area is still, it simply is the world center of tech. How long? There's no one can tell you whether one day what happened to Detroit will happen to the Bay Area, but we don't observe it now. LA is kind of a weirder beast. It's kind of a fuzzier economy and a bigger one than the Bay Area. but it's got a lot of strengths of people who come here for different things. So again, I don't have a like prediction, and it's true. Cities and regions, the key obviously is capturing new waves of economic activity, right? Because you're gonna lose some older ones. And the cities that stay on top in a very long perspective are those that move from the older routine activities that they lose into new areas. Boston is the perfect case of, kind of going from, wave after wave of success with some down periods. So that I'm confident of is in California, if we want to stay being successful, it's being future oriented in the kinds of jobs and industries that we generate or capture. And that's kind of independent of the population question, because most of the kinds of activities we would capture are not like big factories that are really labor intensive. They're going to tend to be, kind of skill and brain oriented industries, right? So we've done pretty well with that as a state over the last century and a half. In fact, spectacularly well. But are we going to be able to continue? Right? And that is a danger if we don't do the right things. We've succeeded with higher education, with mass education, with quality of life, a bunch of things that were sort of like the secret sauce that came together. We have to keep doing it.
Thank you. Paul Kalaki. Paul?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
I can.
So first thing, as with all the speakers, Michael, I just want to thank you for the work that you've done. Some of us who have been in this for 30 years, and to whom some of the economics seems obvious, are validated by really kind of the sanity of some of the things you said, and what the supply side or the upzoning side is saying doesn't really make sense and hasn't really made sense in the area where I live for 30 years. I'd also like to just thank Zelda and Eric Filseth, two people whose work I've stumbled upon. I'm big fans of both of yours. Eric, I was a former official from Menlo Park, so I follow what's going on in that area. I'm going to serve you up a multiple choice, Michael, and you can address whichever one you want. The first one is, even Glacier and Summers wrote something about trying to reestablish the heartland and coming up with policies of place that might distribute some of this wealth to other locations. We don't need to cram everybody into 5 cities. Maybe we should cram them into 15 cities. So you could talk about that a little bit. Or when I look at all the metrics of what density is producing, I see single family homes are off the roof. Where I live, rents are out of sight. Homelessness is skyrocketing. How do we hold these guys accountable using some metric to say, you've failed? It's just not working. That's another one you could tee up. Any one of these are fine. And the last one is, I'm fairly well read on this, and there's intelligent people in New Zealand and Australia, and there's intelligent people in Canada, and there's intelligent people in Great Britain. I mean, that part of why is no one in North America, in the US, saying any of these things besides Michael Storper? I'm just concerned more than anything about sort of the death of intelligence in academia. So that would be a third one. You can pick any one of those. All of them are too big to go into, and pick one. Thanks for all your work.
Thank you. Those are they're really interesting questions. I could start with the latter one and go, yeah, it can be pretty frustrating when your own colleagues sort of seem to be on a different planet from you. Yes. And controversy in academia, that's a good thing.
Yes.
But I think the answer to, at least the way I think about it, is what is not talked about. And land and property and the way of life are like sacred things. And there are just things that are either too controversial to talk about, and therefore I think a lot of people exclude them. So that does, I think, sort of limit the horizons of the debate. I'll say something that, some of you may agree with or not, but when you look at the comparative evidence on housing across the developed countries, what you find in the mix of every other country is some role for either public housing or market insulated housing. The mix is different, but in France, we have a constitution that requires 25% public housing everywhere. I mean, that's like science fiction here. It's a different country with a different political culture, but it's based on the recognition that the market will do well for some groups and less well for others. I don't know how we would introduce those kind of things. A lot of people would accuse us of being, communist or something if we talked about it, right? So that's an issue, is how do we open up the way of thinking and be more expansive? And I could cite, if any of you don't know it, the most successful city in the Western world with housing is Vienna, right? 65% either public or market insulated housing for all social classes, high quality of life, lower costs, it's like a completely tried and tested experiment. It's kind of fun to use because people can't deny that it exists, but the tendency would be to say, well, that's Vienna. So I don't know. I think we need to think about that, though, is how to expand the debate without getting called crazy or communist or something. So the second comment I want to talk about is what these other regions, or what we often call the left behind regions.
Yes.
What's really interesting today, and I think it's really favorable, is it's finally getting some policy attention. For decades, the story was, it's not a problem, it's just a transition from the old economy to the new economy, and those people who can't have a good life there, they should move to opportunity. And the idea was, this escape valve was, if Ohio's not doing well, you go to Phoenix. So a lot of people did and do that, but we now know that these regions have been in distress for a long time. So the good news, I would say, in my world, is we're actually getting traction in what we call thinking about place-based policies. And, the Biden administration has taken it very seriously. They have a whole division in the Commerce Department on regional inequalities and left behind regions. I've never seen that before. Obviously, the CHIPS Act is trying to jam a lot of money at these regions. I don't know if it'll work or not, but the point is there's an opening, because people aren't denying that what they used to do was just say, just wait, it's a transition and it'll take care of itself. And so I think we're in a different world, in a sense of it's a better world, where more kinds of people are taken seriously, that we have to deal with these distressed regions, that people can't just all move out of them. So I'm hoping that we keep doing that.
Thank you. And now David Wheatley, last but not least.
Hi, David Wheatley in Los Angeles, visiting Orange County, where there's a lot of density. Thank you very much for speaking to us today. In the stock market, people try to find leading indicators which will tell them what to buy and what to sell. Have you uncovered any leading indicators that we can point to shut down the YIMBYs or whoever they are, the bad people, and extol our virtues?
That's a good one. I wish, because if I was good at that, I'd be a lot wealthier than I am. Seriously, though, I do think, let's just kind of reiterate, I think, what several of us said today. We need to take the narrative back, right? to me, it's really urgent, and I'm shocked at the way the YIMBYs got the narrative, got the major newspapers, the journalists to buy their line. So I find we just have to really keep working at that and tell the people that we are not deniers. You know, we take seriously the needs for cities to adapt and change, right? They paint us as obstructionists. You know, we don't want to do anything. We're selfish. They've been very effective at marginalizing us. And I think we have to take the narrative back and say, no, they're selling you snake oil. And, you know, we're selling you a realistic and a richer view of the problem. That and most importantly, if their narrative seems too good to be true, it's not true, right?
And as far as that secret metric, if we say, well, people are leaving California, people say good. They're going to Texas, they say good. Only rich people will be able to afford homes. Well, these people will never be rich, so who cares? So I'm wondering if, back to that secret metric, did you find something like those guys in the movies where they go to the truth sayer in the forest who says, what you really need to tell them is this?
Right. So, I mean, that is kind of like, you know, the problem is like, you know, everything isn't perfect in California. We all know that. We have issues. But if you know, again, we should say, measure Texas, I think we should turn it back. That's often what I do in my own academic work, is to say, fine, you can measure Texas. It is a very attractive place to a lot of people. But if you look at the indicators on quality of life, income, amenities, health, education in Texas, I'll be blunt, they're not that great. They've sucked in a lot of people, but their average quality of life is lower, much lower than California, and not just for rich people here. So that's part of the narrative thing too, is there's this kind of journalistic class that buys these really simple views of the world that, you know, they just pull out of a hat. Why should population growth be the only measure of everything, right? It's simply I can tell you there's no academic reason for doing it.
Michael,
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's almost 5:30 and we came through. You came through. Julie, are you still here with us?
I am still here. Thank you, Zelda. So thank you, both of you. Zelda, thank you so much for moderating, helping us with today. And Michael, thank you so much. We've waited a long time to have you here, and it was very worth it. And a very enjoyable discussion. We welcome you back anytime. When you have nothing better to do on a Sunday. By the way, everyone, we did wait for several months because Michael was in Paris for through the holidays, I think. And so he's now back in California for you. Do you do half and half?
Yeah.
Okay.
I teach in Europe in the fall. So, but yes, thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks for having me, and really enjoyed the interaction. It's really nice for me to interact with people like you who are kind of doing the good work.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, we need you to keep writing, Michael. Oh, did we lose you? No, you're still there. That changing the narrative is something we have been very clear on the need to do that. We've worked on it. Many of us have written and tried to get whatever we can published. Many of us work with CALE Cities, our lobbyist organization, and try and get, you know, the message there that the narrative is a false narrative, and it really has been absorbed by too many people. And of course, that's because special interests, real estate, and developers have funded and promoted that narrative. We've had several really wonderful speakers from around the globe who have made very clear it isn't a California narrative or a California problem. It is in fact global, and it's because of the special interest groups globally that are promoting almost the exact same language in Australia, New Zealand, London, Ohio. We've spoke with people all over. So really appreciate your global perspective and your insights. And we will continue to work on it. And we need you to keep writing and put out more of that true narrative. All right, Michael, thank you. Have a great rest of your Sunday. We're gonna chat a
Thank
little
you
bit.
all. Okay, take care, everybody.
All right.